of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 720 offered by the senator from North Carolina, Mr. Burr.
Madam President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Madam President, the Senate's not in order.
The Senate will come to order.
Madam President, I'm going to be brief because I do want my colleagues to listen. This is an important amendment. Today, the VA determination is that if a veteran can't handle their own finances, then their name is referred to the FBI and they're put on the next list. Today, 129,000 veterans are on the next list. Yeah, there's an appellate process to get off, but the appellate process doesn't provide the VA provides no help to the veteran. The cost is all incurred by the veteran. Only 200 veterans have applied for that reversal in the decision, and only 6 have been granted. They should never be put on. A determination that they can't handle their own finances is not a determination that they are a threat to themselves or to the public. This bill is very simple. It says if the VA makes a determination, there has to be a judicial decision to put them on the next list. That's the standard everywhere else in the federal government. I urge my colleagues to support this very important piece of legislation.
Madam President.
Senator from New York.
You know, when we began this debate, we talked about strengthening the NICS system. We talked about how people who have mental illness should be added to the list so they might not get guns. And here, in one amendment, in one fell swoop, we will take 165,000 people off that list. Does my colleague, my dear friend from North Carolina, believe every single one of those people should be allowed to carry a gun? Of course not. If there are injustices to some of those folks, then let's have a system that deals with it. But you don't, in one fell swoop, take 165,000 people, all of whom have some degree of incompetence, off the list. It is unbelievable that at a time when we're supposed to be strengthening the NICS system with people who are adjudicated or judged otherwise mentally ill, that we're considering tonight taking a giant step backward and reducing the list. What is America going to think is going on in this body? I strongly urge a no vote here. I yield the floor.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, thank you, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Collins, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mr. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Donnelly, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Heitkamp, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Landrieu, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Pryor, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sanders, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Tester, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. King? Aye. Mr. Begich? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cowan, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Klobuchar, Lautenberg, Leahy, Manchin, Menendez, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, and Whitehouse. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen? No. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Brown, no.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 44. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Without objection.